Ragnaros 25 Heroic. No jokes, because this fight is no joke. Ragnaros brings more heat than LeBron, and he'll leave you with a tan worse than the cast of the Jersey Shore. LearntoRaid.com is here to guide you, however, and we've packed our Fire Elemental Lord Survival Kit. Suntan Lotion? Check. S'mores? Check. Ragnaros Heroic Mode Strategy Guide? Check. Mate. Ragnaros Heroic is a 4-phase massacre with 2 transition or intermission phases. I'm going to say this only once, not as a courtesy or an accurate fact, but as a warning. This encounter is harder than a 17-year-old boy at an all-girls Catholic school. It will stress your tanking, healing, DPS, movement, and execution, and each time you fail you will not risk a 15-minute run back and rebuffing period, but the tearing of the very bonds holding your guild together. That's right, Ragnaros doesn't kill players, he kills guilds. On Heroic Mode, Ragnaros has around 290 million HP throughout the first 5 phases. He will give up at 10% and re-emerge having healed back up to 50% health. This creates a total of around 406 million effective health. Throughout the fight, the raid will also need to kill Sons of Flame, Molten Elementals, Lava Scions, and Living Meteors. These have 1.2 million, 350,000, 8.7 million, and 3.3 million health respectively. To successfully accomplish the strategy used in this guide, you'll want to bring 2 tanks, 3 to 5 healers depending heavily on your raid's DPS, and extremely strong mobile AoE DPS. Because this is the final boss of the zone, this video will run through all of the encounter's abilities before focusing on the strategy. But first, I'll remind you that we were the 5th guild in the world to kill this boss, and used the strategy that we felt was the most repeatable and, given an appropriate amount of gear, the most lenient. This, however, is not the only way to kill this boss. Ragnaros uses many different abilities during phase 1, all of which can be deadly. For starters, his attacks can open a burning wound, applying a mild fire dot on his primary target that lasts a short duration. The dot will also increase the target's damage done, but this is irrelevant. Sulphurous Smash will be one of his primary attacks. Ragnaros faces a random player and, after a short pause, smashes his hammer onto the platform. The initial impact will kill any player in the smash area and creates 3 lava waves. These lava waves move out across the platform in opposing directions. Any player hit by the waves will take high fire damage, be knocked back, and gain a mild dot for a short period. This dot can be dispelled. Occasionally, the boss will blast 3 random players with his Wrath of Ragnaros ability. This deals moderate fire damage to the target and all nearby players and knocks them back. Alternatively, Hand of Ragnaros deals mild fire damage to all enemies close to the boss and knocks them back. It also interrupts all spellcasting. Throughout the phase, Ragnaros will shoot magma traps. These will be launched at a random player and remain on the platform until triggered. Stepping into a magma trap will trigger it and cause it to explode with its magma trap eruption ability. This will deal very high fire damage to all players and knock the offending player into the air. Additionally, all players will gain the magma trap vulnerability debuff, increasing the damage they take from other magma traps for a short duration. If no players are in melee range of the boss, he will spam Magma Blast, a high damage fire attack that increases fire damage taken. When Ragnaros reaches 70% health, the first transition phase will begin. Ragnaros will begin the first transition phase by casting Splitting Blow. He will slam Sulphurous into the platform, spawning 8 Sons of Flame ads before submerging into his pool of lava. The boss will re-emerge once all Sons of Flames have been killed or after 45 seconds, whichever comes first. Throughout the phase, while submerged, Ragnaros will pelt the raid repeatedly with Lava Bolt, an attack that hits 10 random players for moderate fire damage. Sons of Flame ads will spawn with the Burning Speed buff, causing them to move faster at higher health. This debuff will fall when the ad reaches 50% health. Ads will attempt to make their way toward the hammer Sulphurous. Any Sons of Flame that are successful in this venture will cause a supernova, dealing deadly fire damage to all players. During phase 2, Ragnaros will retain his Burning Wound, Sulphurous Smash, and Magma Blast abilities. He will also gain World in Flames. This is a spell that is channeled over 9 seconds and causes 1/3 of the platform, either front, middle, or back, to be engulfed in flames each 3 seconds. Each segment will remain engulfed for 3 seconds and tick for fire damage every second. Shortly into this phase, and every minute after that, Ragnaros will spawn molten seeds. These seeds will spawn at the location of 20 random players and deal moderate fire damage to the target and all nearby players. After 10 seconds, the seeds will explode, causing a molten inferno. The inferno will deal very high fire damage that decreases depending on the distance from the original seed. Farther players will take low damage, while nearby players will take much higher damage. After the inferno, each seed will spawn a molten elemental. These adds fixate a random player and attempt to melee them. The adds will also gain the molten power buff whenever they are within 6 yards of another add. This buff increases their damage done by 25% per stack and makes them immune to snare and stun effects. At 40% health, Ragnaros will begin his second transition phase. The second transition phase is very similar to the first. The only difference is 2 adds called Lava Scions will spawn in addition to the 8 Sons of Flame. The Lava Scions will periodically cast Blazing Heat on a random player. This debuff lasts only a few seconds, but ticks for mild fire damage and causes the player to leave a trail of fire behind them. Walking into the fire will deal moderate fire damage to any player, but will heal Sons of Flame and Lava Scion adds. After 45 seconds have passed, or after all Sons of Flame have been killed, Ragnaros will re-emerge and phase 3 will begin. Ragnaros will keep Burning Wound, Sulphurous Smash, World in Flames, and Burning Blast during phase 3. If Lava Scions were not killed in phase 2, they will continue to debuff players with Blazing Heat until they are dead. Throughout this phase, the boss will spawn Living Meteors. These are adds that spawn above a random player and fall to the floor. Any player coming into contact with a meteor will cause it to explode in a meteor impact, dealing deadly fire damage to all nearby players. Meteors cannot be killed until the next phase because of the severely reduced damage they take, but due to their combustible debuff, they can be knocked back. Meteors will fixate a random player and roll slowly towards them. Once they are knocked back, they will fixate a new player. When the boss reaches 10%, he will submerge into his platform once more before re-emerging for phase 4. At the start of phase 4, 3 NPCs will spawn: Cenarius, Malfurion Stormrage, and Archdruid Hamul Rune Totem. Additionally, Ragnaros will grow legs and begin to walk around the platform. His lava pool will solidify, doubling the space on the platform as if you hit it with a Serenite bomb. Because the boss is now at full power, he will become superheated, dealing mild but stacking fire damage to all players every second. He will also periodically stomp, causing Dread Flame to spawn at 6 random locations. These fires will spawn as a single patch and grow quickly in size. Touching or standing in the Dread Flame will cause initial moderate fire damage followed by a mild ticking fire damage. Occasionally, the boss will empower Sulphurous. This is a 5-second cast that will allow each of his melee swings to unleash flames of Sulphurous, dealing deadly fire damage to all players. Anytime 10 or more players are within 5 yards of each other, Ragnaros will spawn a Magma Geyser. This will deal moderate fire damage to all nearby players and knock them back. The spell will also destroy any Breath of Frost that it hits. Throughout the phase, Cenarius will spawn Breath of Frost. This is a small patch of frost that protects players within it from taking superheated damage. Additionally, Breath of Frost will trap any living meteors that come across it and cause the meteor to take increased damage for a short period. Hamul Rune Totem will spawn entrapping roots throughout the phase. Ragnaros can be kited into the roots to be stunned for 10 seconds and have his damage taken increased by 50%. At the start of the phase, Malfurion Stormrage will spawn a Cloud Burst. Up to 3 players can interact with this to gain the Deluge buff. This buff grants the player immunity to Dread Flame and superheated damage. In addition, it allows the player to extinguish all Dread Flame they come into contact with. Alright, we've covered this guy's tricks. Let's see how we put him on ice. Phase 1 is about survival. Very few of Ragnaros' abilities can be avoided during this phase, and as such your raid will need to learn how to minimize the damage and handle it accordingly. Begin by properly positioning the raid. Place the tanks here on the right side of the boss, and place the melee on the opposite end of the platform. The melee are free to stack on top of each other because Rag cannot target them with Wrath. To make healing easier, split the ranged DPS on sides of the platform depending on their parties. Have ranged DPS in group 3 spread out on the left, while ranged DPS in group 4 spreads out on the right. Place the primary tank healer or healers on the right side and the primary raid healer or healers on the left side. Any extra healers can be placed in the middle. If your raid is using only 3 healers, place the tank healer on the right, the raid healer on the left, and your swing healer in the middle. Throughout the phase, players will need to move away from magma traps and re-spread from other players after Wrath and Hand of Ragnaros. When doing this, it's important not to impede or endanger healers. During movements, remember not to encroach upon healers too much, as they will be strained and cannot always risk having to run around. On the same note, all players must remember to keep a loose spread at all times. It's almost never safe to stand near other players during this phase. Once the positioning is figured out, the raid must understand the timing of the abilities in phase 1. Wrath will deal damage to at least 3 players at a time, occasionally throughout the phase. Ragnaros will also use Hand of Rag to knock back all players in melee range. These are 2 uncontrollable sources of damage. The source that will be controlled is the magma trap. These are fired at random players and must be triggered to alleviate space during the encounter. Stepping into the trap will unleash very high fire damage to all players and launch the triggering player into the air. Assign any class to this that can avoid fall damage. Mage Blink, Warlock Port, and Priest Levitate are all good options. If possible, the player assigned to this should have good raid frames and remain aware of the raid's general health. The trick is to trigger the trap safely between Wraths and Hands of Ragnaros. If the trap explosion lines up with Wrath of Ragnaros, it can mean instant death for many raid members. The raid will need to watch and wait for Wrath and Hand of Rag to be cast before stepping into any traps. Additionally, always make sure the raid is topped or close to top before triggering the traps. Give a short countdown so players that are not topped can use a cooldown like AMS or Mage Ward. Once the trap has gone off, the raid will be left with the magma trap debuff. Because of this, another trap cannot be triggered until the debuff falls. In order to clear traps as quickly as possible and create more space to spread out, traps should be triggered very soon after the debuff has fallen. Tanks will need to remain mindful of their burning wound stacks and taunt off of each other when it becomes too high. This debuff will also cause the tanks to do more damage to the boss, but this is highly irrelevant and should not attempt to be utilized. Keep this up until the boss reaches 70% and he will submerge for the first transition phase. Transition phases are almost identical to normal mode. The first key difference is that there will be magma traps left up due to the slower pace at which they must be popped on heroic mode. The second change is that suns can spawn anywhere and no longer have set positions. This means the hammer can drop on the right side of the platform with 6 suns of flame adds by it, or it can drop at the middle with a perfect 50-50 split. It is completely random, but this does not make it impossible to plan for. Assign a basic split for the raid first. Have half the DPS responsible for one side and half responsible for the other. Make sure to split up classes that can stun, knock back, and grip to make sure both sides have control for the sun. In the event of a 50-50 or close to even split, this will be enough to handle the adds. After assigning this, select 4 to 5 players for a swing group. This group is responsible for going to whichever side has more adds if the split is not close to even. For example, if there are 5 adds on the right and 3 adds on the left, the swing group will go right so there are more players to handle the higher quantity of adds there. Players should communicate which adds they will be stunning or gripping or knocking back. Healing can be spiky during the transitions, so do not be afraid to use a widespread raid cooldown such as Aura Mastery or Divine Guardian. Players should use their own personal damage reduction cooldowns as well. Kill off these suns as quickly as possible and prepare for phase 2. Begin phase 2 by choosing a side to stack on. This phase can be thought of as having a repeating rhythm or pattern, and the basic positioning for this is simple. The raid will begin the phase stacked very tightly in close melee range of the boss on a far end of the platform. Just before Siege spawn, the raid will run as a tight group toward the middle of the platform, remaining in close melee range of the boss. Siege will explode and the raid will begin to AoE down the adds while running away. Very shortly after the adds die, World in Flames will begin and the raid will need to line dance the fire. Positioning during this is very easy. We'll review this strategy sequentially. Begin by stacking on one side of the room. We'll begin on the left. mark a player for the raid to stack on top of. Timers can be useful for watching when the seeds are coming, but assign one player to make the call to move. Around 1 or 2 seconds before seeds are about to come out, this player will call for the raid to move. At this time, the entire raid will move together as a unit toward the midpoint of the platform. If done correctly, the seeds will spawn just behind the raid and players can avoid the initial splash damage. 10 seconds after this, the seeds will explode for very high fire damage to all players. It's best to mitigate this damage with a raid cooldown, such as Power Word Barrier, Aura Mastery, or Spirit Link Totem. Just before the explosion, however, players must get ready to AoE the elementals that will spawn. There will be a very small window of time to AoE down these adds, and any player that is meleeed will very likely be killed. The adds cannot be slowed or snared, so the raid will need to rely on raw damage to kill them all before they are reached. Casters will only have time to get off 1 or 2 casts before they must run to avoid being hit. Players cannot enter melee range of the adds, so the raid will need to AoE while running away. Very shortly after the adds die, the raid will need to dodge World in Flames. Different areas of the platform will be ignited in flame every 3 seconds. This spell does not leave any room for error. Once a segment of the platform begins glowing, players have around 2 seconds to get out of the area. After that, they will take high fire damage every second that they remain. The ignite segments divide the platform into 3 portions: front, middle, and back. It is important that once this ability starts, the raid positions itself at the edge of the ignite patterns. This will allow players to take 1 or 2 steps in order to avoid the fire, instead of needing to run too far forward or backward. It is very easy to be clipped by the fire and end up taking a dirt nap, even if it looks clear. Once the raid is done dodging World in Flames, players should quickly stack back up to prepare for the next set of seeds. In addition to handling this, the raid will need to detonate the magma traps remaining from phase 1. There will probably be 2 or 3 traps still up from the first phase, and the window to safely pop them without killing the raid will be quite small. The best time to set off traps in phase 2 is just after World in Flames dance, while the raid is still stacking up for the next move. This means during World in Flames, healers will need to work very quickly to top off the raid, so the assigned player can trip the magma trap as soon as possible. Use healing cooldowns such as Divine Hymn or Tranquility to help top the raid back off after the trap, because there will only be around 15 seconds before the raid must move again for the next set of seeds. The raid will need to do 3 to 5 sets of seeds depending on the boss DPS, so this phase can be as much about endurance as it is about execution and DPS. Once the boss's health reaches 40%, the second transition phase will begin. Just as in normal mode, the second phase transition is almost identical to the first. 2 lava scions will spawn at the start of the transition phase and must be picked up by the tanks. These adds will occasionally cast a debuff called Blazing Heat that players must run out of the raid. As they do this, debuffed players will leave behind a trail of fire. Adds that move through the fire will be healed, and it will be more difficult for the raid to kill off the Sons of Flame if this occurs. Immunities such as AMS or Cloak of Shadows can and should be used to avoid Blazing Heat. Players who can't get rid of it will have a short window of time to run toward the back of the platform where they can safely drop their trail of fire out of the ad's path. The next phase is a big DPS race, and lava scions serve as nothing more than a DPS sink. Because of this, the raid will need to do as much damage as possible to the scions during the transition, in addition to handling the Sons of Flame adds. Ragnaros re-emerges when all of the Sons have been killed, or after 45 seconds. Because of this, it will be much more beneficial to leave one Sun up until just before Rag comes back up. This will allow the raid more time to DPS the scions, so that ideally the raid can enter phase 3 with both adds already low if not dead. Once phase 3 begins, the raid will need to focus on the boss immediately. Positioning and assignments in phase 3 are simple. There are essentially 4 groups: front right and front left, as well as back right and back left. In the front right group are the tanks and the right side meteor punters. In the back right group are the tank healers, any swing healers, and half of the range DPS. In the front left are the melee DPS, and in the back left are the rest of the range DPS and the raid healers. During this phase, Ragnaros will spawn living meteor adds that fixate a random player and roll toward them. These meteors cannot effectively be DPS as they take significantly less damage, but they can be knocked back with any attack. The goal is to keep all of the meteors rolling back and forth through the middle of the platform throughout the phase. This phase is all about burning the boss as quickly and as hard as possible to get to phase 4 before there are more than 2 meteors out. Assign 1 player on each side to punt the meteors when they come in range. Any class can do this, as any attack will knock the meteor back. While doing this, and burning the boss down, the raid will need to dodge World in Flames. This works exactly as it did in the previous phase, and is partially why the groups are positioned where they are, approximately on the faults or the edges of the Ignite regions. Once the boss reaches 10% HP, he will submerge one last time into his platform, and phase 4 will begin. Fixated players will kite the meteors toward the front of the room, where the NPCs are, while the rest of the raid prepares to unleash on the boss. Players cannot begin phase 4 on the lava portion of the platform, or they'll risk falling through the world. Instead, gather on the edge to be ready to attack Rag as soon as he re-emerges. Meteors will be frozen during the transition, but can still be punted away. Move them as far to the front of the room as possible while this occurs. Ragnaros will begin phase 4 by climbing out of his pool just before it solidifies. The now solid lava can be walked on and almost doubles the space for the raid. This phase is about survival, execution, and DPS. Positioning is dynamic depending on where different spells spawn throughout the phase, but there is one basic formation that the raid needs to become familiar with. Shortly into this phase and throughout the rest of the fight, the raid will need to make its way to small blue void zones called Breaths of Frost. These will spawn in random locations, and the raid must stack inside the area to avoid taking damage from superheated. This is not as easy as it sounds, however. Players will need to stack in 3 evenly spaced groups of 7 to 8 players each in 3 corners of the circular Breath of Frost. We call this the Flying V. Now that I think of it, you're stationary while in the breath, and the Flying V moves, so yeah, we definitely aren't raid led by Emilio Estevez. Let's call this the Triforce. It's extremely important that anytime the raid is within the Breath of Frost, they maintain the Triforce formation. Failing to do this will risk spawning a geyser, doing heavy fire damage to all players, knocking them back, and more importantly, destroying the breath. While players are standing in the breath, the meteor will still require kiting. Targeted players must safely and carefully run out of the group and kite the meteor away from the breath. Assign 2 players in the breath to focus on punting meteors. Players returning from kiting a meteor must take exceptional care to move carefully back into the proper group. Meteors will be destroyed during this phase, but that will be covered in a moment. Shortly after the first breath spawns, a blue water bubble known as Deluge will spawn in a random location. 3 assigned players will interact with the Deluge to gain its buff. These 3 players will become immune to Dread Flame and superheated damage, and will be able to extinguish Dread Flames by running over them. Dread Flame is cast by Ragnaros every few seconds, increasing in frequency as the phase goes on. It creates multiple patches of fire at random locations on the platform. It will be up to the Deluge players throughout the fight to run around and very quickly put out as much Dread Flame as possible. Eventually, it will become impossible to keep up with all the Dread Flame that goes out, so it's important not to fall behind too early. Start by splitting the raid into 3 sections and assigning 1 Deluge player to each part. Oftentimes, Deluge players will need to properly prioritize different areas. For example, Dread Flames close to breaths are more important than Dread Flames in the middle of nowhere. If a Dread Flame spawns under the breath or under a group in the breath, call for the nearby players to move away before running in to clear it. This will lower the chances of spawning a geyser in the area. Throughout the phase, the NPCs will occasionally spawn in trapping roots in random locations. Kiting Ragnaros into these will stun him for 10 seconds and increase the damage taken for a short duration. This may seem like a tempting offer the moment the roots appear, but this stun should be saved to counter Rag's Empower Sulfuras ability. Throughout the phase, he will empower Sulfuras, causing each melee swing to kill the raid. This spell has a lengthy cast time and lasts only 5 seconds. During the cast, the tank will need to kite Ragnaros through the entrapping roots so that the boss is stunned during the Empower Sulfuras buff. This will prevent him from hitting the tank and keep his buff from destroying the raid. During this phase, the raid will also want to kill off any remaining meteors. Normally, the meteors cannot be killed because of their damage reduction buff, but if a meteor is kited into a Breath of Frost, it will be frozen and take increased damage for 10 seconds. Unfortunately, this will also destroy the breath, so the raid must wait for an extra one before doing this. Alright, that's a lot of information to take in. Let's break this down step by step real quick. Phase 3 ends. Kite and punt the meteors toward the NPCs at the front of the platform. Ragnaros emerges and the raid begins taking superheated stacks. The first Breath of Frost spawns and the raid goes into Triforce positioning. Deluge spawns and the 3 assigned players use it to begin putting out Dread Flames. Trap spawns and the tank must kite rag to it for Empower Sulfuras. The second breath spawns and a meteor is kited into it to be killed. The third breath spawns as the first one despawns and the raid moves to this new one. A second trap spawns and rag must be kited into it. When the fourth breath spawns, kite the second meteor into it and kill it off. This is the basic order of events and priorities throughout the phase. Once both meteors have been killed, the fight becomes about moving to new breaths, kiting the boss into traps, and staying ahead on Dread Flame. Keep in mind these 3 concepts. The first thing that every player needs to concern themselves with is properly positioning themselves in the breath and being comfortable running in and out of their groups without causing a geyser. After that, every player needs to understand how to properly kite meteors not only out of the group, but into breaths quickly if needed. It is a good idea to use a damage reduction cooldown if leaving the Breath of Frost is necessary. If the whole raid is leaving the breath, use a Stampeding Roar or any other movement buffs to quickly get to the next and out of Superheated. Deluge players must be able to efficiently and quickly decide which Dread Flames are worth chasing and putting out, and which ones must be ignored. They also need to communicate when groups must move away from the breath so they can clear nearby Dread Flame. Tanks need to be able to make their way to traps and successfully kite rag into them. Oftentimes, traps will be deep in fields of Dread Flame, and the tank must use cooldowns, soak up heals, and pray their way through the fire in order to get the boss trapped. Movement spells like Heroic Leap and Leap of Faith can be very useful for these situations. As long as each player remembers their job and keeps a level head, the boss will fall. It sounds like a lot is going on, and that's because there is. Think of it one piece at a time and it all comes together though. Each player has a different and unique responsibility, and more than any other fight in the game's history, focus is key to success. There is extremely little room for error in this fight, so players must concentrate at all times during all phases. That said, getting to phase 4 is honestly the easy part of the encounter. Each phase is a new benchmark. Try to look at the progress you are making instead of the progress you are not. Reaching a new phase should be thought of as reaching a new plateau. Finally, don't let yourself get burned out on this encounter. It will take quite a while to down this boss, and no amount of slamming your head against it will change that. Go for short periods of highly focused raiding instead of long nights of poor and draining attempts. If you found this guide helpful or enjoyable, please bookmark us at LearntoRaid.com. Subscribe to us on YouTube, Justin TV, and Blip TV, and follow us on Twitter. Good luck, and we'll see you at Deathwing's door.
I wasn't feeling so good. I just didn't feel like playing anymore. So I went home, and I got all comfy and cozy and all scrunched up in front of my phonograph. And I sat there and I closed my eyes and listened to all the sweet music.